So what is the difference between 3/4 and 6/8? Or more specifically, what is the difference between two measures of 3/4 and one measure of 6/8? Especially when you're listening, how do you know what meter you're in? All right, so looking at 3/4 and 6/8, they both have 6/8 notes in them, right? And with the 3/4, I'm going to group them in groups of 2, right? So altogether, I have 3 groups of 2/8 notes each. Whereas in 6/8, I'm going to group them in groups of 3, right? So I'm going to have 2 groups of 3/8 notes each, right? So you can see very clearly just from the beaming, the way these 8th notes are beamed together, which one it follows. But when you're listening, how do you know when it's 2 measures of 3/4 versus 1 measure of 6/8? Because they both have 2 groups of 3 on the surface, right? And I could count 3/4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, but I could count 6/8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So how do I know I'm supposed to start over at 1 or I'm supposed to go all the way to 6 when I'm counting? So today I have 5 methods for us to really break down, is it 3/4 or 6/8? And we're going to use all of these methods together to finally come up with the answer, 3/4 versus 6/8, which one makes the most sense just by listening. So let's dive in. All right, so this first method might be a little oversimplistic, but it's so important to really think about it. Are you feel like more like you're bobbing up and down, or are you swaying maybe more side to side? So to break this down, when I have the 2 measures of 3/4 versus the 1 measure of 6/8, right, I can see that they both have 2 groups of 3. But in 3/4, I'm counting the quarter notes as 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This kind of bobbing up and down, this waltz feel with it. Versus in 6/8, I like to count 1 and a 2 and I have more of this swaying action to it, kind of like a pendulum going back and forth, right? And some people I know like to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, kind of gets you to the same place. But I really like the 1 and a 2 and you feel the 2 big strong pulses there, the 2 big beats, 1 and a 2 and a. So to see this in action, I want you to really listen. Do you feel more like you're bobbing up and down, or are you swaying side to side, just as a basic place to start? So here we have this one. So that to me, I felt more like bobbing up and down, more like a waltz feel. Versus this example I'm about to play, do you feel more like you're bobbing or more like you're swaying? So just a really basic thing to start. Do you feel more like bobbing up and down in a waltz feel, or are you swaying more side to side? So this next one, getting into some more concrete ideas, we're going to listen for the accompaniment. So specifically, usually piano or the guitar part. What are those instruments doing in the background? So in 3/4, some common kind of accompaniment patterns we might have is the waltz feel, the pa pa, or the boom chuck chuck maybe. Right, again, kind of bobbing with that, or more of maybe arpeggios, and the arpeggios tend to always go up like this. Right. Oh, so some basic 6/8 accompaniments. We might have something more like this where the 8ths keep going. Right? Or a really common one is to have the arpeggios, but the arpeggios are going to go up and down with it, and we get this. Right, so there's some basic accompaniment. So let's actually look at some songs that will have this. So here the arpeggios tend to always go up. Or another one, this time using more of the pa waltz feel with it. Now back in 6/8, more swaying side to side. Listen for this accompaniment going up and down with it. So this next one, getting into the harmony changes, meaning the downbeats. When do the chords change? And we're listening for, usually they change on the downbeat. So in this Edelweiss, right, you can see every 3 big pulses, every 3 beats, we have a chord change. Really common one, hallelujah. We're listening for every 2 big pulses or 6 little pulses if you're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But the chord changes again on the downbeat for the most part here. So before we get into the last two methods, I have this really cool free gift for you. It's just a whole list of 3/4 versus 6/8 songs, right? So I have links to Spotify and on YouTube, so you can have what you prefer. And it just has a bunch of them so you can practice side by side. I even have a Spotify playlist where I mix them all together so you can quiz yourself and then go back to the PDF. So let's dive in looking at the last two options. So next we have the downbeat accent. So just looking at the pulse strength itself. So quick review, right? We have our 8 notes, 6 8 notes in each measure of 3/4 versus 6/8. 3/4, we like to group them in groups of 2. 6/8 grouping them in groups of 3. So when we go one level higher than the 8 notes, we get to our beat level. So in 3/4, right, we have 3 quarter notes, right? Versus 6/8, the beat is technically the dotted quarter, right? So I have 2 beats in 6/8 here. And so in 3/4, I like to count 1 and 2 and 3 and to feel all the beats. And again, that would be a simple meter because again, the beat, the quarter note is divided into 2 8 notes. Versus a 6/8 would be a compound meter because the beat, the dotted quarter, is divided into 3 8 notes each, right? So again, the simple is a little easier to me. So each beat divides into 2, whereas compound's a little more complicated. Compound, complicated, right? So the dotted quarter beat divided into 3 8 notes each. Right? And again, compound, if you think of the term compound, it's like you're putting 2 things together. So it's almost like you're putting 2 measures of 3/8 together and you create something new entirely with it. Right? So looking then at this nice graph of pulse strength, right, we can see that the downbeat is usually the strongest beat. No matter what meter we're in, usually the downbeat's the strongest. So we have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 for our 3/4 measure versus 6/8. If I count just the beats, I have 1, 2, 1, 2, right? So each downbeat is the strongest pulse, right? So when I put the 3/4, the 2 measures of 3/4 back up versus the 1 measure of 6/8, and I put the 8 note pulses back up, all right, I can see that they're very, very similar, but in simple meters, the 3/4, right, each downbeat's more or less the same, right? So I have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, looking at my graph, versus in compound, the second beat, the second big pulse is technically weaker. So I have 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and with it. So again, the downbeat's stronger, beat 2 is a little weaker. And I think that changes how we listen and how we perceive the music. So looking at actual music with this, I have here the first Noel. And so every downbeat is more or less the same, right? And I still have the bobbing feel of the pa accompaniment and the harmony here. I have more harmonies, right? But more or less the harmonies are changing mostly on beats 1 and 3. So here's the first Noel. Versus something like Greensleeves here, or you might know as What Child Is This? The big thing here is that we can still sway side to side, but the harmonies are changing more often. It's not just the downbeats, right, that they are changing. So the big thing we're going to listen for is the pulse strength, right? So the downbeats of each measure is going to feel stronger, even though the harmony might change halfway through the measure. It's not going to feel as strong as when the harmony changes on the downbeat. So let's listen to this. Okay, so our final method is listening for the drummer. What is the drummer doing? Especially what are they doing with the snare? So what I mean by that, if we go into 3/4, most of the time the drummer is going to hit on beats 3, right? So looking at our pulse graph, usually beat 3, that third quarter note is where they're going to hit, like this. But here in 6/8, most of the time they're going to hit on beats 2. So that 4th 8th note in 6/8, like this. Right? So the big thing when you are listening, do you hear it happening like what could be a downbeat? The big thing, they are not hitting on the downbeat of every other measure in 3/4. That just won't happen. The snare won't happen there. So let's listen for some actual music. So I have here an Amazing Grace in 3/4, and later I'm going to switch it up and do Amazing Grace in 6/8. So you can see side by side, the drummer is going to help us a lot, knowing is it 3/4 or 6/8. All right, so very clear the snare is happening on beat 3. All right, versus here a 6/8 version of Amazing Grace. Let's listen. The drummer is going to be hitting on the beat 2, right, or the 4th 8th note in each measure. right, so again, very clearly, the drummer was hitting on the 4th, 8th note of each measure, right? So right in the middle of the measure. So listen for that snare. That'll tell you a lot. 3/4 versus 6/8. All right, so some final thoughts is sometimes music isn't going to fit perfectly into a box of like 3/4 or 6/8, and that's okay, right? I don't think music was meant to fit in a box, right? But we have these ways to organize music, organize our thoughts. So if it makes more sense in 3/4, great, use that. If it makes more sense in 6/8, great. And sometimes it's just fun to try to blur and make it challenging, especially when we get into a very fast 3/4 or a very slow 6/8. And there's plenty of examples of both of them. But again, listen for the drummer. The drummer is going to tell you so much about the groove of how to feel it. And before you go, don't forget your free gift. I have a list of just a whole ton of 3/4 versus 6/8 songs. You'll find it super helpful. Again, I have a Spotify playlist too where I've mixed them all together so you can really practice. Do you hear it more of a 3/4 or a 6/8? Go back to the PDF that I've given you and you can check your answers from there. So how do you tell the difference between 3/4 versus 6/8? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, sometimes you guys, the community, have the best ideas. So check out the comments below, add your voice, or if you have questions, let me know. I'm here to help. Thanks and have a great day.